Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Jerry, and today I'll be presenting our team's capstone on sustainable procurement in the city of Cleveland. Before I begin, I just want to thank my incredible team, faculty advisor, and client. Today, we'll be going over our project implementing sustainable procurement in the city of Cleveland. We'll be sharing our research methodology, our findings, and how that led to our recommendations, and of course, ending with a conclusion and implications for our client. Earlier this year, our client released a 10-year strategic operational plan, one of the initiatives in which was to make sustainability investments with long-term financial benefit. As part of this initiative, the city committed to establishing a sustainable purchasing policy that drives decarbonization and circular economic practices. That's where we come in. Our team was tasked to develop this sustainable purchasing strategy covering both policy and implementation. Now, why is procurement so important? Why focus on sustainable procurement? In short, it's about the money. According to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, 15 to 20% of global GDP is linked to the procurement process, and almost half of that comes from smaller governments like the city of Cleveland. To put this into context further, let's look at the city of Cleveland. It has a population of about 360,000 people, but even for a city of this size, we're looking at a budget of about $2 billion. And last year, they processed over 2,500 competitive bids and contracts. So that's a lot of money and a lot of decisions that can go towards goods and services that are an environmental negative or something that can be beneficial for our environment and society. And one of the reasons we were so excited to work on this project was because of this amazing momentum in Cleveland. The current mayor, elected in 2022, has put sustainability at the forefront of his agenda. In fact, this year, he was voted as chair of Climate Mayors, really showing a commitment to sustainability in Cleveland, but also across the nation. Because our project was really focused on not just policy, but also the impact of this policy, our research process was very action-oriented. Starting at the top, we wanted to understand what were the potential activities that Cleveland could go through in terms of their policy and also implementing it. So we looked at sustainable purchasing policies across the world, resulting in a city benchmarking. To understand the situation in Cleveland and what recommendations made the most sense for them, we also conducted a SWOT analysis within Cleveland. And combining both of these, we sought to understand implementation through a comprehensive feasibility analysis. Our research really started in understanding policy and policies around the world. We analyzed over 20 global geographies, identified thematic areas across them, and developed a rubric that we then scored 13 U.S. geographies against to have a better understanding and comparison to our client. We also looked at kind of tangential areas, things like human capital factors like organizational structures. We looked at KPIs, technology, data, and of course, because purchasing has historically become a cost-oriented exercise, we really looked at the financial context of all of these activities. Our secondary research was given context to and validated by several interviews that we conducted with our benchmark cities, with interviews with our client and city officials, and with subject matter experts across all of the thematic areas we identified. And all of our research really came together to form the implementation feasibility, which really formed the basis for most of our recommendations. On the left side here, you'll see we covered the SWOT analysis for the city of Cleveland, and we matrixed them against our thematic areas, being regulatory and policy factors, stakeholder engagement, financial and cost factors, and finally, supporting ecosystem. Due to time constraints, I won't go over every cell here, but quick reminder, strengths and weaknesses on this slide are internal to the city of Cleveland, and on the following slide, opportunities and threats are external factors. So thematically, what we saw on the strength side was the city of Cleveland has really had a strong focus on social equity in the past, and that has translated into processes which can be enhanced to focus on environmental aspects as well. And of course, that really strong focus on sustainability with the current administration. On the weaknesses side, we saw that a historic lack of investment in environmental infrastructure left several gaps, including gaps from a technology standpoint and education. In terms of opportunities, a big opportunity really came from this national momentum. There's a lot more available funding and resources available now, many due to the Inflation Reduction Act. On the threat side, there are many legacy agreements in place that threaten the future sustainability of Cleveland, one of which is a group purchasing of fossil fuel energy sources. Also, because Cleveland isn't the largest city, they often have difficulty looking for local vendors that are able to meet many of the sustainability requirements and criteria. All our analysis is really translated into what we call a sustainable procurement toolkit. The first tool in this kit is a value and feasibility matrix, which looks at all of our activities and puts them into a prioritized form. We also have recommended policy language, third-party resources and how they impact our other policies, and finally, an overall engagement strategy. Starting with a value feasibility matrix, across all of the activities, we essentially scored them with 3 value assessments, being environmental, economic, and social, and 3 areas of feasibility, being cost, organization, and dependency. Each area was scored 1 to 3, 1 being low value or feasibility, and 3 being high value or feasibility. On the left here, you'll see all of our potential initiatives mapped out. Overall, we identified 22 potential initiatives from activities that have been conducted around the globe and the conversations that we had with many SMEs. Out of those 22 initiatives, we identified 9 high-priority initiatives reflected in the top right quadrant. These are essentially high-value, high-feasibility initiatives. And from there, we identified 3 that directly impact the procurement decisions and 6 others that are supporting factors from a knowledge and organizational perspective. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Before I go into the policy itself, I really wanted to talk about the importance of third-party resources in our policy recommendations. Eco-labels ensure standardized criteria for buyers and suppliers, so they really do the work, so to speak, for our clients in terms of providing right criteria and, more importantly, the quantitative metrics that are important in making decisions through the calculators that often supply the back end. Unfortunately, there aren't eco-labels for every single category that our client procures for. However, we do have the recommended ones for key categories that are very high in purchase value on the right side. The eco-labels really form the basis or form a lot of the understanding of how we should approach decision-oriented policies. In many ways, these policies are the most important because they directly impact the thousands of purchasing decisions that the City of Cleveland makes. Our first policy recommendation is implementing minimum standards for goods and services, with criteria including things like energy efficiency, materials used, etc. And this will be implemented and scalable through the use of eco-labels. The second policy recommendation is to compare environmental metrics like emissions or solid waste the same way that you would compare costs when coming to a purchasing decision. And the metrics for this type of comparison would likely be provided by the calculators from the eco-labels on the previous slide. And finally, our last recommendation is to include incentives for environmental factors like bid discounts or points to vendors that have third-party certifications or other environmental factors. These decision-oriented policies are just one part of a larger structure that's really necessary to have an effective implementation of policy. So we see here that the decisions are really in the center there on the right, or in the middle. But when we talk about what's really needed to have an effective policy, there needs to be an organization support that really drives it forward, and this is something that was consistent in our research. So one of the core recommendations is really to establish a cross-functional team, and that cross-functional team is responsible for this implementing these policies and ensuring the success of them. But in order for there to be a long-term impact, there really need to be these decision-making framework that carry on the policy in the face of a changing landscape. So there are 2 specific decision frameworks that we identified. The first being a quantitative environmental impact framework, and the second being a comprehensive cost framework. From an organizational standpoint, we also saw it was very consistent that defining sustainable purchasing goals, particularly from a quantitative standpoint, was very important to success, and of course, tracking those metrics and KPIs. On the comprehensive cost side, we saw that while lifecycle costs were very important to integrate into procurement decision, the technology and data availability wasn't there to be able to insert into the process. Regardless, it's really important for the City of Cleveland to take on that lifecycle mindset because it's really part of this paradigm shift towards sustainability. And when we look at all of these factors together, the decision-oriented, knowledge-oriented, and organizational-oriented initiatives, they really build up the body of work that's required to carry on sustainable procurement policy in a meaningful way, covering not just policy, but really a successful implementation. So in conclusion, our client, the City of Cleveland, recognizes the impact and benefits of implementing sustainable procurement policy. Our research has shown that policy alone is not sufficient, and therefore our recommendations take a holistic view covering policy and other critical factors. If implemented, our recommendations will impact the City of Cleveland's 2,500 procurement decisions, making a material and measurable impact. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for this presentation. It was great. Could you expand a little bit more on just what you're envisioning for cross-functional teams? Maybe just provide an example.
Sure. When we looked at what was necessary to implement procurement policy, we saw that the procurement team itself was largely an operational team. In other words, there were decisions or budgets and kind of criteria that were made ahead of time, and they were essentially implementing the policy and processes. So if you think about what's necessary to actually implement this, the procurement team is the end result rather than the beginning. So what we saw as being quite successful was ensuring that in all of the supplementary teams' job descriptions, that there were things related to procurement, that there were procurement KPIs as well as part of that. And so both from an implementation standpoint and the long-term impact of the project, we saw that that's kind of how cross-functional teams should be set up. Thank you.